Our gospel reading this morning comes to us. It is portions of the 7th chapter of Mark's gospel. So I encourage you now to listen for the word of the Lord. Now when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there were also many other traditions they observe, the washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" And he said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.' Then he called the crowd again, and he said to them, 'Listen to me, all of you, and understand. There is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. For it is from within the human heart that evil intentions come: fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, slander, pride, folly. All these evil things come from within, and they defile a person.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So I don't know if you saw it, but there was an article out this week, a news headline, that there was a hiker left behind on a mountain in Colorado. Maybe you saw this, but apparently this is a work retreat of about 15 people hiking, and it was at high altitude in Colorado. In fact, they were climbing Mount Shivano. I had not been on that climb. I've been on other hikes on other mountains very similar to that, and they went to go up Mount Shivano, and 14 came back down. 15 went up, 14 came back down. Now, you know there's a problem right there, right? One hiker was left behind on the mountain summit, according to the article, stranded as strong storms passed through the area, buffeting him with freezing rain and high winds that caused him to fall dozens of times, apparently, attempting to escape the mountain. 15 hikers were, as we said, on a work retreat, and on sunrise, they took off on Friday morning up the mountain, with one group attempting to reach the summit and another ascending the mountain's saddle and returning from there. Search and rescue officials commented on this and said, in what might cause some awkward encounters at the office in the coming days, I would think, wouldn't you? One member of their party was left to complete his summit push alone. The man reached the peak of the summit around 11:30 a.m., but when he turned to descend the mountain, became disoriented, catch this, when he found that the group had picked up the belongings being used as trail markers as they hiked down before him. He tried to make his way down the mountain, but he quickly got turned around and found himself in the steep boulder and scree field on another part of the mountain. And so he sent his location to coworkers that were already descending and further down the mountain, who informed him that he was on the wrong side of the mountain, and which he had already figured out, it seems like. Notice they didn't go back up and help find him. The abandoned hiker finally reached the correct trail at around 3:30 p.m. and texted his coworkers he was back on course, and then a strong storm came and stranded him up there overnight. He was fortunate to be alive. The next day, he still had battery in his cell phone. He was able to call for help, and he was found. Apparently, though, he reports that he fell some 20 times during the storm trying to find his way back down. Now, all kinds of things must have happened in between the lines of this story, right? All kinds of things must have happened. But when things go bad, when things go really bad in our lives or in our circumstances, usually there's more than one cause, right? Usually there's a series of mishaps along the way that kind of lead to things turning out the way that they do. In this case, we have what appears to be two groups of people that are ascending the mountain. It was pre-agreed, it sounds like, that one group was not going to go all the way up, but the other group was going to go all the way up. But then when it came down to it, it wasn't another group going all the way up, it was one person. Well, that's kind of unfortunate. Then there's also something called summit fever. I don't know if this applies to this gentleman or not, but when you get close to the top of a mountain and circumstances change, maybe people backed out and said, I don't want to go after all. What happens is we can tend to think, well, I'm so close, I just want to finish. And so even if the circumstances shift and you really shouldn't go, it's wise not to go. What ends up happening is you feel like you just have to, need to, I'm so close, I got to do it. That's called summit fever. One left on top of the mountain, fairly late in the morning. Hiking out there, usually you want to be up on the mountain and back down by then. Okay, but he made it, and he's on his way down. What happens? The stuff that was left behind for him to find his way had been picked up by the rest of his coworkers. Can you imagine? Mishap after mishap after mishap. I'm not picking on these people, but you can see how these circumstances line up. And he was so fortunate after getting caught in this storm, right, to have survived it and to have had battery the next day to still call for help and for a search and rescue team to be able to find him. We can imagine his work life, their work life together would be strange, wouldn't we? There might be some tense words, some passive aggressiveness, maybe some sarcasm moving forward. I have a bit of confession this morning. I don't always give vent to it, but I can have a sarcastic tongue from time to time. One of my favorite t-shirts that I've seen several times says, I'm really happy to be here. Now you can read that a variety of ways, but I've always chosen to read that with just a hint of sarcasm in the t-shirt wearer's voice. That's kind of funny, but sometimes sarcasm is not so funny. William Faulkner famously quipped about his daughter when he was trying to write one day, and his daughter, being a child, was interrupting him, and he said to her, "No one remembers Shakespeare's daughter." Ooh. Those kinds of remarks hurt, don't they? And they might hurt for a long time. Hurt for a long time for her that she told the story decades later. Yeah. It's kind of what Jesus, not kind of, this is what Jesus is talking about, isn't he? The things that are within that come out that are the source of defilement, that are the unclean things in our lives, our words and our actions. The tongue, as James tells us, has the power to do good, it has the power to do harm. Proverbs also says a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. So when you think about our words and our actions that come from within, which is what Jesus is pointing at, we have to think about where things go right and where things go wrong within, that these things come out of us. And I have to laugh, you know, when things do get tense, when words do turn sour in our relationships, how do we handle them, right? There's a story about a pastor who received a series of letters one morning, and he opened one of those letters, and it contained one single word. The word was fool. Quietly, he shared the letter with his congregation the following Sunday morning, and he said this. He said, "I've known many an instance of a person writing a letter and forgetting to sign his or her name. But this is the only instance when I have ever known someone signing his or her name and forgetting to write the letter." Not all of us can have as much presence of mind as this pastor, when words are tense and cruel. So Jesus is talking to the Pharisees who are concerned about cleanliness and defilement, and he's telling them to consider their words and their actions that flow from within. To break down the cycle of angry and hurtful things that we say and do to each other, to God, to others, and ourselves. And he's challenging them to consider where sin really comes from. Just like in the case of the hiker left behind, there's a series of things that lead to the sins in our lives, right? That ultimately flow out from us. What are the circumstances that lead to our hearts and minds being in such a state that things come out before we even realize that we're saying them? That we respond, we react to circumstances in certain ways and look back and say, why did I do that? Right? So let's look at what Jesus is doing here, what he's saying here. The Pharisees, they have a series of things that they do, things that they clean, right? Because they're so concerned, and rightly so, about being clean, that they wash their hands. And that certainly is taught in the scriptures, to wash and be clean. We see that, we hear that, right? We even have our ritual cleansings that we perform. But he says they've tried this. Jesus points out, they washed their hands and then that didn't work, right? They still felt unclean. So what do? Well, they're also going to wash anything that they purchase at the market to eat. And they're also going to wash the cups. And they're going to wash the pots. And they're going to wash the bronze kettles. Why? Because they washed one thing on the outside and recognized somewhere within them they still felt it. They still felt selfish. They still felt unclean. They still felt unworthy of God. They still felt unloving or unjust or unrighteous. And so the ritual grows to try to catch it. Where is the sin coming from? Where is the filth? Where's the dirt? Where's the uncleanness coming from? And Jesus rightly identifies. It's not coming from the things you're cleaning on the outside. It's coming from your mind and your heart. Jesus knows that these washings, they're not going to solve the problem. Some dirt is on the inside. So where does that come from? Original sin? Sure. The cycle of woundedness in our lives? Yes. The trauma handed down from generation to generation? Yes, of course. How we respond to adversity, how we respond to trauma and distress when wounds fester? Yes. This is where these things come from. The voices that we hear, some of them that we're subjected to and we have no control over. Some we choose to hear that do nothing but fuel anger and discontent in our lives. Ultimately, these things go in and we think on them and we ponder them and they reside within us until they shape our minds and our hearts, and that affects what comes out of us. In some ways, the Pharisees were right to be concerned about what they were ingesting. They were just going about cleaning it up the wrong way. And yes, washing your hands is important. But so is paying attention to the things that we take in, the things that influence our minds and hearts, the things that help shape who we become. Ritual worship is good. Yeah, it's a good habit. It helps do that. But that's part of it as well. And the ritual can't replace our careful curation of and our intentional meditating on the things that do happen, the things that we do face, so that we're ready to respond in kingdom ways, ready to respond through the fruit of the Spirit. So yeah, it's a series of events that leads to the unfortunate circumstances in our lives. We know that, we get that. But we have to choose to think generous and just and patient thoughts for ourselves, for others. We have to choose to ponder the goodness of God, not to be what is it, toxically positive. But to be careful about what good and bad things do to who we become. We have to think just and patient thoughts, especially on behalf of those whom others might not be so patient with. That's not always easy to do. Or that our systems might tend to ignore. That's not easy to do either. But all of that flows from the heart. All of that flows from our heart. So tend to your hearts and your minds well. Amen.